In basketball, they say a good rebounder knows where to be at the right time. A good sports reporter happens to be in the right time as well when all of the greatness is happening. And Ted Sobel, my guest today, has found himself in some of sports' greatest moments of the course of his career. He is a staple in Los Angeles sports radio and has been for so many years. He's currently with Sports USA Media. You can follow him on Twitter at Ted Sobel Sports. He recently put out a book. We're going to talk about it. It is called Touching Greatness, and it is an encapsulation of everything he has been able to do and afforded himself from his career, meeting some of the greats in a wide variety of different sports. As you can tell, he loves sports based upon his background and all the memorabilia he has. So we're excited to highlight you here, Ted. I'm Bryan
Thanks,
Fenley
Bryan.
with Fox Sports Radio. I'm on Twitter at Bryan Fenley. So before we dive into this book, you, in essence, I would think, Ted, touching greatness is you being right there and watching greatness in sports unfold. What is your greatest moment over the course of your career?
Wow, that's almost impossible to answer. There's so many of them. First of all, again, thank you very much for having me on. A lot of the greatness is lucky timing too. You could be at 100 games and 99 of them might be just another game. But there might be that one game where it's like, wow, that's really special and something that people will always remember. So, all that is, I always say life is timing, and it really is. And my book is not just sports. It's, there's a lot of music and entertainment and how those greatness of whatever field it is, those people intertwined in my life. So there's a lot of that as well. But from a sports standpoint, if to be a Tiger Woods event, not just winning a Masters, but the way it's one of the great comeback stories in all of sports history just a couple of years ago, and to cover that one was extremely special. Just you talk about another game, the last game of a Lakers season. They're a million games out of first place. The game is absolutely as meaningless as any Lakers game in their history, except for one thing: Kobe Bryant scores 60, and all of a sudden it becomes another wow moment. So those are a couple of more of the recent ones. I can go way back into the 60s, just being there. My boyhood idol, Don Drysdale, breaking the all-time scoreless inning streak at 58 and 2/3 innings. I was at the stadium at about the age of 15, at the right place at the right time, in the first row behind the Phillies dugout as he broke the record. And I'm yelling at Gene Mauch, the old Phillies manager, for telling Drysdale, "Hey, you're putting junk on the ball and you're making it move." It was so much fun. It's all in the book.
So we're going to talk more about Don Drysdale. Obviously, an unfortunate sequence at the end of his life, and how it was a life that had so much more living, and you called it one of the toughest moments of your broadcasting career when that happened. I want to touch on that. You brought that up in the book. As far as other notable names, Elgin Baylor, I wanted to discuss your relationship with him, and as a child, what you were able to do. And then you brought up Tiger Woods, and then let's not forget the lunch you had with his dad. So there's so many things I wanted to focus on here. But as I listen to you, Ted, I hear just how crystal clear your memory is. How is your memory so good? How do you remember? I can't even remember everything like verbatim, but your mind is just unbelievable.
Well, thanks. Well, first of all, I don't remember what I had for breakfast today. So I only try to remember things that are important to me, right?
Yes.
I've heard that before. I never think about that. I believe that so many times these stories have come up in my life. It's one of those things where you can't forget it because they keep happening. There's things that my mother reminded me all those years. I was a year or 2 years old. Of course, I'm not going to remember that. But you keep hearing it over and over again. It's like, oh, it's just sort of part of you. So there's a lot of that. But I did start to take notes about 20 years ago, Bryan. Randomly, just grabbed sheets of paper, literally right out of the copy machine. And I thought, there's a couple things I want to make sure I remember to write about. So I just scribble something on a piece of paper and just throw it in the file folder in the drawer and forget about it. So that stuff, and then if you read that, then it brings back another memory and another memory. And then let's not think about the hundreds, and I mean literally hundreds of hours of research I did for this book, because I wanted to make sure everything was absolutely accurate. So that was extremely important. Like, the Drysdale stuff, I remembered being there, but I went back and read the game stories from those to make sure that I got it right. Because sometimes you don't remember every little detail, So I and a lot of it did surprise me. Like, well, I remember that. I remember that. I remember that. But so many interviews I've done over the years in regarding those stories as well, that also helps the memory because it just sticks. You talk about it so many times. That's sort of the premise of the book as well, because people kept telling me, hey, Ted, you got a story about Joe DiMaggio. You got a story about Ted Williams. You got a story about this guy, that guy. You should write a book one day. So here it is, Touching Greatness.
So what I remember in reading through your book is that when you met Ted Williams, it was like you showed up and he was like on his way out of like a store or something like that.
Sears in Hollywood.
Yeah. And then your dad spoke up, right? If I'm not mistaken, and said, hey, my son Ted is here. Can you please shake his hand? And so like, I go back to something that you talked a lot about in your book about your dad's influence on your life and how I would think Ted, in large part, he helped grow that fascination and love with sports. Where do you think your life goes without your dad introducing you to sports and what would then spawn this love affair with everything sports related?
Well, I love that question. And first of all, I also like the response of, if I was born a woman and my mother brought me up, it might have been a whole different ballgame. So it's a lot easier, to say that. I have no idea where it would have gone. Because look, the word passion in the book, I've written it so many times. It's, to me, if you don't have passion in your life, it's sort of like, well, what is your life about? What is there? What's there something special about waking up every morning, right? You got to have a passion. It doesn't have to be sports. It doesn't have to be anything specific, but it should be something that you look forward to because it brings the best out of you. So sort of that was raised in me by my father. When he went to Madison Square Garden as a kid growing up in New York and going to the heavyweight fights of Joe Louis and all those greats from those days. And then the early days of the New York Knicks, when it wasn't even the NBA yet, we're talking way back there. And my favorite father story, my dad worked at Yankee Stadium when Babe Ruth played. I mean, that's what really got it. Because when he used to tell me that, and then I would watch the old movie, The Pride of the Yankees, which was about Lou Gehrig, right? And then the way he got ALS and eventually died from it. But Babe Ruth was in that movie. The real Babe Ruth was in that movie. And I'm not a guy who likes to watch movies more than once in general. I've probably seen that movie 50 times, and it gets me every time. And I think there's something about being at Yankee Stadium, knowing my dad worked there. And in 1931, when they were at their peak and at their greatest, I mean, it's something that it's totally ingrained in me. And that's got me going specifically with baseball. And then it grew from there. My dad was a gambler, and he was watching football games on a Saturday or a Sunday, and I'd be sitting there with him. He goes, well, this team might be winning, but we need another touchdown, that kind of stuff. So that got me into that side of it as well. It evolved throughout the decades.
How often do you think of your dad to this day?
Well, the best thing about my book by far is that I get to talk about him all the time.
Yes.
My dad has been gone since 1972. All right. When I was 19 and a half, he passed away. And people now ask me about my father. And I get a real kick out of it. It's like, you wouldn't know my father if he tapped you on the shoulder, but it's pretty neat all these years later. And, just the fact that I got something right here. I'm going to bring it into the picture.
Yeah, let's see it. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay.
Got it.
This is a Bernie Sobel of California piece of clothing from the.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. And it's something that's still sold on eBay. If you go to eBay, every once in a while you put Bernie Sobel of California. Some of his clothes are sold. He made women's clothes, right?
Wow.
That, by the way, that was not prepared. That was a prop. Just happened to be right there.
Sure.
I promise you, it really wasn't prepared. But anyway, it's fun. The people are still buying his clothes from the '60s. So it's a really neat part of the book. The best thing by far.
Ted Sobel is with us. You can, of course, catch him on Sports USA Media, hosting NFL, NHL. The list goes on. I'm Bryan Fenley. In writing this book, how was it cathartic? And what did you learn about yourself that you didn't know about yourself until you started putting pen to paper and putting this book together?
Very cathartic. I didn't realize by far. I mean, I never even thought about how emotional I would get writing some of the stories. It was like, wow, that really got me there, that kind of stuff. And it happened a lot. But outside of that, nothing surprised me a whole lot because I've been sort of prepping for this the whole time. What surprised me was the amount of time I was going to spend doing the research. That's really, I mean, that was a killer. I couldn't believe how many hours I spent on that. But to me, it was more important. And I brought back a lot of things. I got a lot of fun facts and did you know little
Yeah, I love that
blurbs
part of it.
that I think it makes it, first of all, an easier read. But I think it brings up stuff that people in a million years wouldn't either A, know or B, remember or C, ever know that it would have existed. The younger people, anybody under the age of 40 would know a lot of these names. And I only bring them up because they were somehow in my life at the same time. I think they were important to be remembered and sort of forgotten in the history books, in my mind. Even a guy like who's a Hall of Famer, like Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch, right? Former Los Angeles Ram from the late 50s, maybe got into the 60s, I'm not sure. But, he's one of the all-time great receivers to this day, right? Well, I mean, people now, unless his name comes, because his name Crazy Legs, but which, by the way, he preferred to be called Crazy Legs than Elroy. And I think I would be too. But anyway, he ended up being sort of my boss when I was a hockey announcer at Wisconsin because he was the athletic director there. And I got a chance to go into his office and talk to him. And his Rams helmet was in the old school Rams, which they should bring back, by the way, in my humble opinion. The new stuff, no thanks. I mean, it looks like a neon sign on Sunset Boulevard that went bad. It's not for me. But anyway, to me, why not bring a guy like that back? You should know he existed, and those kinds of names from the past. They had an unbelievable life, and I don't want them to be forgotten if they were in my life. So that's why I brought them up.
There are so many people, like you just mentioned, who you remember and you tell their stories. And I encourage everybody to get Ted's book, Touching Greatness. And one of the names on top of who you just mentioned that you bring up is Don Drysdale. And you mentioned in your book, and Vince Scully called it, as I'm sure you felt the same sentiments as well, as with Don's passing, that had to be one of the hardest times for you as a broadcaster because of your connection and your tie to him. What was that like as you were dealing with that moment in your career?
Okay, well, let me ask you something, Brian. Who was your favorite athlete growing up?
Honestly, Tiger Woods.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So if Tiger Woods, something, and it almost did happen, unfortunately, but fortunately he's fine now.
Yeah.
But if something that tragic happened and you had to go on the air the next morning and talk about your boyhood, the next morning, not the week later, the next morning, and that night prep for your morning sportscast before there was the internet. So I had to go back and get an album of Don Drysdale's highlights with Vince Scully calling and stuff like that. And then because I worked at KMPC, which was the Angels station, and Don was also one of the Angels early announcers as well, working with Dick Enberg. So I had some sound to use, but I had a hard time. I mean, I put it all together. Everything was just a normal broadcast, as I've done. I joke in the book, I've done over 40,000 sports updates. Start counting to 40,000 and wake me up when it's over, right? Anyway, so that was a few of the 40,000 that next morning. And as soon as I turned the microphone and I started to talk about my boyhood idol, who meant so much to me in so many ways, had just died the night before, I caught myself several times, like short breath. I almost broke down. I was stunned. Even though I knew how much he mattered, you're a professional. You turn the mic on, you just talk. It didn't work that way all that morning. So that was, as I said, the most difficult morning or broadcast of my life. But you got a job to do. And then I covered his funeral as well. And that was also very difficult because I do live reports from there. But there was something about that next morning, just the toughest of all time.
Ted Sobel is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. You asked me about Tiger Woods, and when he had that car accident, I kept going Ted, to those commercials where you hear Tiger's dad talking from Nike. And my dad, your dad passed away when you were a teenager. My dad passed away when I was a teenager. And so there's a lot of experiences with our fathers that we didn't really get to experience. But I hear a
Right.
lot of my dad in Earl Woods in those conversations, and why when Tiger had that really, horrific experience with the car here in Los Angeles, I broke out. I couldn't stop crying. And I'm sure for you, some of those great role models and people you look up to, like Don Drysdale, the reason for how hard it is to deal with and how you went through those sportscasts. I don't know how you did it. But speaking of Earl, a person that you got to know on an intimate level, had a conversation with him. I don't know what I would give my life to have 5 minutes with Earl Woods. What was it like getting to chit chat with him and pick his brain?
Well, it was early on. Tiger was still had become a star, but he hadn't got quite to that high level yet. So this was at Sherwood Country Club when Tiger first started going over there with his uh, silly season. They don't call it that anymore because now we're playing during the silly season.
Yeah.
But this time of the year used to be the silly season, and that's when Tiger's tournament was at Sherwood. When he took over for the old Shark Shootout, which was there for many years, and I used to cover that every single year. So I covered Tiger's tournament too. So at that time, they finished the news conference before, and we were just having lunch, and randomly Earl just sat down right next to me. It was just a total random thing, and we started talking. And it was probably 20 minutes, it wasn't forever. But I started asking him questions, trying not to sound like a reporter because I didn't have the microphone in his mouth,
Yeah.
but just, friendly chatter. It was like so the stuff about not being too overly, because he was a military guy and a very disciplined one. And I was wondering how much of that went into Tiger, and a lot of it did. Um, but I don't know how much that Earl really wanted to tell me from deep down inside because he was a little bit. He would hold back on stuff, and I can understand. He's a little paranoid about people saying good, bad, or indifferent stuff about his son that maybe weren't quite right. But at the same time, if you don't get it from the horse's mouth, where are you going to get it from? So that's why it was a really great conversation, and he came across as a guy who just only cared about one thing, and that was success for his son. But I'll never forget him saying, my son is more than just another guy, and he's not just another great golfer. He's going to be the next blah blah blah. And that turned out to be whether it was Martin Luther King or actually he never said Martin Luther King. Let's go back, to the greats of their time, and he said he was going to be the next Gandhi. Gandhi. I remember I must have the stupidest look on my face when he said that. It was like, okay, well, you're. He said, by the way, he said Gandhi at L.A. At the Riviera Country Club.
Sure.
Because that was that was Tiger's first thing. But then I sort of followed up on that when it was there about the importance of what Tiger can bring to every community, and he's done it. My biggest disappointment in Tiger is that he didn't come back to LA every year and play at Riviera for almost a decade. I had the same issue with Pete Sampras because at UCLA, which you know very well, I was the voice of the UCLA tennis tournament for 15 years on the court, and Pete never showed up except for one time when we invited him to be the honoree. And he's a great guy, and I like him personally. I like a lot about him. He's a very reserved, very inward kind of a guy, and he didn't like even just a wave. And he even said to me once, and I got an interview online. He said to me, "I don't like to wave. That's not who I am." He's very, very introverted. So, but I still thought he should have shown up because he grew up in this town. This town helped make him, and he should be giving back in that way. That's the way I felt, and a lot of other people did too. So that was a big disappointment. But there was a similarity there between Tiger and Pete, and really two of the greatest of all time in their sports in this town. There's a real similar story there, and it was disappointing that now Tiger's name is on the tournament, so obviously he's going to be here. And I got a nice chance to chat with him that week, this last one where we got hurt early on in the tournament, because I was asking a couple of questions for my book, and he gave me 30 seconds, but that's fine. It's all I needed. He's an interesting guy. I love how he's evolved because, he's pretty much been a computerized person, as a human, being raised the way he was, and also in the time it was, I like the idea he went to Stanford to get away for a couple of years, or a year and a half, whatever it was. To me, that sort of let him become sort of a normal person, right? Because he didn't have a normal childhood.
Yeah.
You're a prodigy, right? You're your father's all-time gem, and you're a prodigy at what you do, and you're great. Now the question is, how is it going to turn out professionally for a long career? But to me, Tiger has evolved as a person. I think a lot of the things that have happened in his life, which he's caused, almost all of them, has humbled him in a good way. So, he's now treating the media, and not that we're important, but we do give him 24/7 free publicity. I mean,
Yes.
we nobody talks about that ever. I'm the only one who ever talks about that. It's like it's the only business in the world where you get 24/7 free publicity in whatever you do in sports. Free. You don't have to spend one penny marketing anything. Now, if you want to, that's great. And after we help you make billions of dollars, you can afford to market yourself.
Yeah.
But it's the truth, Not that we're not, because we're not important, but we are a part of that pie. That without the media, remember, they used to beg us to come to games. Now it's like, no, we don't need you so much anymore. We got our own website. We got our own person that covers the team. They give us the narrative we want them to have, not your narrative. And now we're charging you $10 to come to eat instead of here. How all the free food in the world. It's a different world now, Bryan. That's just reality.
So you run into guys, and I would think Tiger and even Pete Sampras, they have the introverted qualities about them. I don't see a lot of introverted characteristics within you, Ted, and no. I certainly didn't. In reading that section of your book, which again, Touching Greatness, everybody go get it.
On Amazon,
get it. Everything. We get everything on Amazon. All you got to do, type in Touching Greatness, Ted Sobel, and make it a part of your family room table. Put it right on top. You watch sports, and then thumb through some stories. But one of the stories, there it is. You and Kobe Bryant, tales from the front row with heroes and legends. Speaking of one of those heroes,
yes,
Elgin Baylor.
Absolutely.
So here you are. You're if I'm getting this right, Ted, here you are. You are this kid, and
15.
You have this dream. And so many kids would have been afraid to go up to one of their heroes. So how do you have the guts to go up to the Baylors? And then look what happened after that.
Well, a lot of that stems from my dad again. He was one of those go for it guys, literally go for it. To me, I learned if you don't go for it, you're just going to be another person left behind. You got to open your mouth. Now I many times open my mouth, too many times, right? Or too loud. That you got to learn there too. But sometimes you just got to go for something because it's there. And if you don't do it, it might be the only opportunity you have it. And then later, I mean, how many people your entire lives you regret? Oh, if I would have done this, if I would have done that. I try not to be that guy my whole life. Fortunately, I learned at a younger age. I didn't have to go, if I only gave that a shot, So when I went to Fairfax High School, and just 15 and a half years old, whatever I was when I got there, and I was playing B and C basketball, right? And the guys were telling me, hey, you moved into the neighborhood where Elgin Baylor is, and Elgin was still a player then, right? It's 1968. So it was a few years before he retired. And we're talking about, as Chick Hearn always called him, the former Laker great announcer, the pound for pound, the greatest player who ever lived at that point. Absolutely the greatest player. And there are guys to this day who's still around who saw Elgin play. They say, they'll take him over Michael Jordan. And that's the truth at his peak, right? So, because he hurt his knee and all kinds of stuff. And it was a different medical world then too. You know, you have a knee injury now, you might come back. Then you were almost done, almost for sure, right? So, and so many things have changed, and you can't compare eras. So, to me, when I found out Baylor, and I used to live up Doheny Drive, okay, way up near the top of the hill. And that's where I moved out of Culver City. I grew up in Culver City, and I have a whole chapter on Culver City in the book and what that was like in the 60s, which was wild because that's where all the TV shows were all made there, and it was in the streets in front of us, and it was great. It was great stuff. So anyway, I used to hitchhike up the hill because I didn't drive yet. You know, I'm only 15 and a half years old. It's a hitchhike every single day from school to home and then up the hill as well, right? Too long of a walk up the hill. And my parents weren't home from work yet. So they weren't always home to pick me up and drive me home. So anyway, I had to figure out a way to get home. So you probably wouldn't know this name. You're a little bit too young for this, but Della Reese. I don't know if you remember that name, but she was on a TV show called Touched by an Angel. It's
oh, I've heard of the show name. Yeah.
She was the star of that show, and she was one of the she was a really big star in the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, right? She lived up there, and she would pick me up sometimes. She lived halfway up the hill. So she would pick me up and drive me halfway up and then drop me off and say, you know, and she was just a really nice lady, right? So one day she dropped me off, and I'm always wondering, am I ever going to see Elgin Baylor drive up the hill? I wonder if he'd ever pick me up, you know, that kind of stuff. So one day the cars are always driving by, and I was just finishing the rest of my walk up the hill, and I looked over my shoulder, here comes another car, and I looked in the window, and it's like, damn, that's Baylor. I couldn't believe it. I absolutely, it's like, wow, he does live here. So to compare it to now, if you lived down within a short block of LeBron James, right? And you're a big LeBron James fan, like there's only a couple of billion of them, right?
Yeah.
Right. And if you're walking down the street and all of a sudden LeBron drives by and you're 15 years old, you're thinking, wow, wouldn't that be awesome? If he would have stopped and picked me up and we could have talked, you know, that kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's all fantasy, but it's not far fetched. If you live close by, you're a neighbor now. You got a little different connotation there, you know. So anyway, I thought, okay, now I looked at the car. It was a brown, I think it was a Buick Skylark, you know, one of those giant boats, just the size of a yacht. It was so big. It was probably getting 3 miles a gallon, you know, those in the old days in the 60s.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I got to find that car. I got to walk around this neighborhood. I got to find that car and find out where Elgin lives. And that was my whole goal in life for a few months. I didn't do it every day. I did it when I had time. I was at basketball practice after school and stuff. But I wandered through especially on the weekends, wandered up and down. And one day in a cul-de-sac, there was that car parked in front of the garage at the end of the cul-de-sac. And I said, it was like one of those things. Okay, great. You found gold, but it's not your gold. You can't take it home. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do with it? It's like, I don't know. I got to knock on the door sometime. So I went home. I thought about it, told my parents, and my mother said, hey, you know, he's only a neighbor. You can just say whatever you like, right? You just want to meet him. And that's what I did. So a couple days later, I knocked on the door. I was so nervous, Bryan. The heart was pounding out to here. I joke in the book that if I was my age now, then I would have keeled over.
Oh my gosh.
I was so nervous. It was unbelievable. But it's probably the most nervous I've ever been in my life. And his first wife, Ruby, answered the door, and she was thankfully very nice because she could have been, you know, just sort of push me aside kind of a thing, but not at all. And I said, I'd like to meet Elgin. And she said, well, that's very nice. She said, he's taking a nap. It was an off day from a game. I think there were 2 off days before games, if I remember correctly. And she said, if you come back tomorrow about the same time, it was like 4:30 or something in the afternoon. You come back the same time tomorrow, I'll be happy to introduce you to him. Like, wow. And I ran home and I told my mother, I said, hey, I'm meeting Elgin tomorrow. She says, are you serious? First, she didn't even believe me, but she started laughing. She says, you're unbelievable. You're just like your father. And I used to hear that, you're just like your father, because like, if you want something, you just go for it. That's all. Right. And I knocked on the door the next day. She closed the door. She said, 1 minute. She closed the door. And then Elgin walked over, the door opened. He said, and he stuck his hand out. He goes, hi, I'm Elgin. And I looked up like to the clouds, right? He's 6'5", 225. I looked up to the clouds and I said, and I was thinking to myself, No shit, you're Elgin, huh? Like I thought you were Don Drysdale. Anyway, he invited me in, spent about 20 minutes with him inside his trophy room, which
Wow.
which eventually would be the room a few years later where I did my first one-on-one interview with anybody. Now, can you
Wow.
imagine your first interview ever before you even knew how to use a microphone? You sat down with Tiger Woods in his trophy room. That's
Wow.
what it was like for me.
Wow.
And we're talking about he was the best player in the NBA then,
Yeah.
right? So it was just, and then Elgin allowed me, and I say allowed because he didn't have to. He allowed me to be in his life. He would take me to games occasionally with his two young kids, and I went on Elgin Baylor night. They took me to the game with him, and it was just an incredible thing. And by the way, Elgin Baylor night, I've never heard of this before or since. Now maybe it's going to happen, but I've never heard of it. They had an Elgin Baylor night. It was about a year and a half before he retired. Okay, I mean, who has a special night for a person
Yeah.
before they retire? That's how good he was. And without Elgin Baylor, there would be no Lakers here in Los Angeles. And I talk about that in the book, in the chapter. Because he saved the franchise when they were moved from Minneapolis to here. Uh, Bob Short, the original owner of the team who moved him to L.A., talked about it all the time. If we didn't get Baylor, we were done. We were going bankrupt.
Wow.
So yeah. So anyway, it's all in the book, and but it's a special pride thing to me. And unfortunately, Elgin just passed away this past year. He didn't get a chance to read the book. It bothers me greatly. I mean, Drysdale's been gone a long time, but those kinds of guys, Dave Hull, a guy probably you never heard of, the Hullabalooer, a great Los Angeles radio disc jockey, huge radio mentor to me. I have some great stuff about him in the book, and he just passed away too. He was in his 80s. So it's all timing there. It hurt. If you write something and you want your family to read it and your family is gone, there's going to be a hole there. So it's sort of like that.
I got one final question for you here.
Yeah.
Ted Sobel is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. So,
Only one more. I can handle three more.
well, I want to be very judicious with your time for you
No
because
problem.
I'm very grateful for your time. And so you mentioned all of these athletes, and we could go on, and everybody, please go get the book on Amazon, Touching Greatness. But from Baylor from Tiger, and you look up to all these people, and what you're doing, Ted, is you are living your reality is most sports fans' fantasy, because you are becoming up close and personal with them, which is not something everybody can do. So you get to highlight all those you look up to. My final question here, and I want to leave you with this, is what is it about you that people should look up to you?
That's a good interesting question. No one's ever asked me that one before. Good. First question anyway.
I was hoping, I was wondering, I'm like, Ted has done 1,004 interviews. What's a question that he hasn't been asked before? Let's go with this one. I wanted it to stand out in some way.
Well, first, before I go there, I want to say, and I don't want to say it lightly, but I think it's important that I didn't necessarily look up to everybody that I wrote about in the book. Okay. So could you say I looked up to them? Not necessarily, because they're pro athletes or musicians. I got a chapter called Laurel Canyon Days, growing up in the '60s around the musical era of Laurel Canyon and how that shaped the world literally at that time, right? So there's music in there as well. To me, it wasn't as much looking up to them. We mentioned Drysdale and we mentioned Elgin Baylor. Those two guys I did look up to, but those were boyhood idols. As an adult, I don't look up to athletes. Okay. So to me, especially after the thousands of events I've covered, they're not all look upable. You know what I mean?
Sure.
We just have to go through the news every day, and but it's no different in every business. You can have a shoe store, you can have a great salesperson, and another person who's an idiot who screws around, and they need to be fired. So there's no difference there. Just happens to be that these guys make a lot of money at what they do. So some of them handle the money great, and other ones have no clue how to do it, and those are sad cases. So I don't look up to all athletes by far, but to me, to look up to me, I mean, I don't like talking about myself in that vein. I just hope the book shows my honesty and passion for things, that I hope it's an inspiration to a lot of people, that you need to do what you want to do, because people are paranoid. People are intimidated by things in life, right? And you shouldn't be. I mentioned, I think it's in my introduction, I mentioned that if you don't have a passion, Bryan, you're sort of like a leaf on a tree, right? You just sort of exist, and then eventually you fall off and it's over. I mean, literally, if you don't have a passion, what are you doing every day? So to me, I hope I can get a little some of that out of people. And originally from my father. And if one person says to me, "Hey, I love your dad," who they'd never met in a million years, and they say, I love what he taught you, and I've got a little of that in me because you wrote it. That's what I would like to get out of it. I don't think anybody's going to look up to me for any other reason. I always talk about touching greatness is not about me. It's about the people in my life. I just happen to be the guy there. If you ever saw an old movie, Zelig or Where's Waldo, I'm sort of a combination of all those guys. I just happened to be there when Tiger did this thing. I just happened to be there when Kobe did his thing. I didn't do it. I was lucky that I was there and I was working. So I don't want anybody to look up to me, but I hope they respect me, and I hope they respect my honesty about life and everything that I do, because there's no BS in my life. I have no time for it. It's such a waste of time. It's the old story: how much more negative energy takes more out of you instead of positive energy, right? So if I give a story, it's not in the book, but I tell a story about Rick Barry, the great NBA player, right? And I once spent 10 minutes with Rick Barry. I asked him to read a little card saying, "Hi, this is Rick Barry, and you're listening to Ted Sobel on KMPC," I think it was at the time, right? And I walked up to him and I had the card, and all I do is put his name in it, right? And easy thing to read. And he was just into broadcasting at the time, and he was working for the four-letter network. And he looks at it and he goes, "I can't read that." And I said, "Why can't you read that?" He goes, "Well, because I work for this and I do that, and I don't think they like it." And he started, and he goes, "And I don't have time for that stuff anyway." And he went on for 10 minutes telling me how he didn't have time to do something that would take 2 seconds. Literally, 2 seconds, right?
Oh my
Okay,
gosh.
so it's a great example right there. Negative energy. It's such a waste of time. It's a waste of life. So I'm trying to. I hope I can bring some positive thoughts. It's not all positive. It's 98% positive in there. Hey, if a guy's a bad guy, he's a bad guy, and it comes across in a story. But for the most part, touching greatness means a lot. And the word greatness is overused, but not in my book.
Well, there is greatness in you. There is greatness in your father. And I thought that for you, being able to pen that book, bringing back those memories of your dad had to be so cathartic and nostalgic
Totally.
as well. So, and there's
Now here
no
we are
better.
talking about him, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
almost 50 years after he died, we're talking about my dad on a podcast. I mean, I think it's great.
And there's no better, I think, compliment, as you pointed out, Ted, than somebody saying something about your work and how it reminds you or them of your dad. I think that
Absolutely.
there's nothing for the relationships that I think you and I both had with our respective fathers. There's nothing more that we want to do in our lives than to
Did your
continue.
dad get you into sports as well?
Well, so when my dad was sick, he had a really bad bout of cancer, and all we did was watch sports together. He was in a hospital bed, or he was at home sick from when I was 12 to 16. And that's how he and I bonded. We would watch anything, Ted. We would watch, it doesn't matter, horse racing, anything. That was how we connected. And then, when he died prematurely, it was like me finding myself and trying to find ways to remember him and live in his honor. And I know that that's exactly what you're doing.
No doubt.
And yeah.
You know what? Seriously, if it wasn't for my father, I'm not sure I would have written this book,
Wow.
because I wanted people to know about him and the influence he was on me, and the influence that he could be on other people, but he never got the chance to be because he died at 55. And I'm now much older than he was when he passed away, which is a really weird feeling. And my father's 104th birthday would have been just a few weeks ago. So it's really weird. You think of your father 104, I haven't seen him since he was 55. That kind of stuff creeps into your head. Your own mortality is always there. But when you can bring out something years and years later, if you could talk about your father and somehow get him into a conversation, you're going to always appreciate that, right?
Yeah.
So you're a great example of that. You know, you lost him young too, and we're never going to get to know exactly what our adult lives might have been like,
Yeah.
with them. But they're always with us.
They're always with us.
So
And it happens to be that today, as we tape this on November 9th, a Tuesday, that this was his birthday. So
really,
it's touching that we get to have this conversation, you and I, Ted, because
and I love that, by the way.
Yes.
My father's birthday was October 27th. All right.
Okay.
October 27th, 2000, and I always forget. I think it's 2004. Was that when the Red Sox finally broke the?
Yeah, 2004. Yeah, that sounds right.
2004, right? They broke the curse of the Babe. That day, October 27th, my dad's birthday, I called up Babe Ruth's daughter and spoke to her on the phone the morning before the curse of the Babe was broken. And we talked about that. And that conversation will be in my audio book, by the way.
Oh, cool.
I'm going to have a lot of the interviews with Kobe and Tiger and stuff in the audio book. So that way it'll be not just me, because who the hell wants to hear me all day? So it'll be a different kind of an audio book than anyone ever had.
Well, Ted, yeah, as we wrap up here, so just for everybody to understand, the book Touching Greatness behind you, and you showed us the cover, is on Amazon. That's probably the best way? And
Yes.
then give us a look ahead to these audiobooks, when you expect that to come out and when people can get their hands on that.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have the time to do it as much as I want now, because it's football season of Sports USA. We do NFL doubleheaders. So I'm probably going to go full speed ahead in January on that. Hopefully get it done within several days, couple of weeks. It will be probably on Coach's Choice, which is another place you can get the book. That's my publisher, COACHES, coacheschoice.com. And that's where, but we haven't done it yet. So it's still, I started it, but we got a ways to go. And I still have to pull out which audio clips I want to use and which ones I want to use the whole interview or just a couple of comments from. I mean, that's a lot of editing. I don't even want to think about it. But anyway, more work. What can I tell you? But it's fun. You know, it's fun. It's time consuming, but hey, I chose this, so I'm not complaining, you know. But bottom line is that I think it's going to be a very different kind of an audio book, and I'll certainly let you know when it's coming.
Yeah,
out.
please let us know. Would love to discuss it with you. And
Absolutely.
even if it takes a lot of work, you have the passion, obviously. So that will carry you through. Ted Sobel, a legend in Los Angeles. Follow him on Twitter at Ted Sobel Sports. I'm on Twitter at Bryan Fenley. Ted, this was so much fun. I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate it too. Thanks a lot. And all your followers out there, Brian's too much fun. Follow him.